Hello, welcome everyone to our webinar, the JC series, the aftermath of COVID-19, the new social impact ecosystem. What we're trying to do with this seminar, with this webinar series, we're trying to bring interesting ideas that should become mainstream in the aftermath of the COVID-19. Now, just a little, everybody's talking about severe economic conditions in the aftermath, and there is a very high potential that there would have business violations of human rights. Business violations of human rights will increase, and governments may be forced to sort of ignore or look the other side under the pretext of not hampering economic growth. Now, our speaker today is really one of the authorities in business and human rights, Dorothée Baumann-Pauly. She is the director of the Center for Business and Human Rights at the Geneva School of Economics and Management, that's at the University of Geneva. She still is, and she was from like a while back, director of research of the business and human rights at Stern. Stern is the business school of New York University. Doro is very instrumental in a gathering of School of Business. It's called the Global Business Schools Network for Human Rights. It's a group of schools of business that is really orchestrated by Doro and Mike Posner, who is the director of the Business and Human Rights at Stern. And they have a meeting once a year that happens in parallel with the same time of the UN Forum for Business and Human Rights in Geneva every November. Now, Doro is really, again, for me, she is the authority. I mean, everything I know about business and human rights, I learned from her. So without much ado, I'll pass the Doro. He's going to talk for 25 minutes, and then we will take questions through the chat box. Thank you. Doro, please.
Thank you so much, Ali, for your very kind and generous introduction. Ali and I interacted for a few years now, and it was always Ali who came to Geneva in the past, but every time he came, he brought me things from Egypt, from dates to beautiful books, and I would love to come and visit. So this is as close as I can get to Egypt at this point, and I'm really honored to be part of this series. So let me share my screen with you. I've prepared a few slides, and does this work? Can you now see my slides, the opening slide? Fantastic. So here you can actually see a picture of Geneva, and you can see in the background a bridge that actually goes over two rivers that merge. And what we're trying at the Geneva Center for Business and Human Rights is to merge two fields that have previously been separated, namely human rights and management studies and business education. And in my personal capacity, I also bridge two institutions that are still unique in the world. On the one hand, as Ali said, I'm directing the new Geneva Center for Business and Human Rights at Geneva University. And for the past 7 years, I worked at the NYU Stern Center for Business and Human Rights, and I'm still their research director. Those two centers are unique in the world because they are the first centers at business schools that explicitly focus on the human rights impact of business operations. And we actually have a joint vision. I'm sorry now. We would like to challenge and empower current and future business leaders to advance human rights in corporate practice, in a nutshell. And the network that Ali mentioned actually brings together almost 50 business schools around the world that believe human rights are a topic for businesses because disrespecting human rights creates operational and reputational risks, and therefore need to be managed proactively. And human rights challenges are particularly complex and I think underexplored. And we are hoping to generate a first generation of business school students that had the luxury to discuss business and human rights challenges in the safety of a classroom, to be then better prepared for those new challenges that we're facing in a globally connected world. And the COVID crisis, I think, highlights those challenges clearer than ever before. So I come into this presentation with two hypotheses. First of all, how companies handle the COVID crisis will affect their recovery and business sustainability long term. And second, companies with business models that integrate human rights in core business processes are better prepared for post-COVID-19 time. So the title of this talk, of course, suggests that I know what will happen post-COVID. Disclaimer, I don't, we're in the middle of it, but I think it's timely, yet timely, to imagine what a post-COVID-19 world could look like. And I'm making the argument that integrating human rights in core business processes makes companies better prepared to handle the crisis, handle the recovery, and handle business sustainability long term. I have focused in my research on different business sectors, but for over 10 years, I've followed the human rights in the garment industry. And I know that Egypt also has a flourishing garment industry. And so I thought it's best fitting to use the context of human rights in the garment industry as my example throughout this presentation. So as you probably saw, a lot of organizations are now starting to track company responses to COVID-19. This is just one little graph. This is actually cut off on the top, which shows how are companies reacting to this crisis. How do they see their social responsibility in relation to COVID-19? And I think most companies, this is a website from the US, Just Capital. As you can see in the US, since they don't have universal health care, a lot of companies are now providing at least sick leave, for example, for their employees. So their common responses, greater generosity towards sort of their employees. But for example, when it comes to caring for their business partners in global supply chains, fewer companies are looking into their leverage and what they could do. I've summarized this a bit differently, sort of the typical company responses to COVID-19. I think there are a lot of companies that initially were in a panic. They have transactional relationships with, for example, their suppliers in the supply chain, and they shut down production and they cut off all business relationships because they saw that, well, shops are closed, so they cannot sell anything, and so they just basically pressed pause on everything they did and also dropped suppliers in the supply chain to a point that they even refused to pay for orders that they're already made, meaning, for example, in the garment context, that they placed an order and production started and production was ready to be shipped, and the brand then said, no, sorry, we don't want this anymore and we don't want to pay. That was one panic reaction from some brands. Other brands said, this is a terrible crisis, and we see that the private sector has a profound role to play to address this crisis, and we will give money. So a lot of companies have been terribly generous in providing funds for various relief funds or in a philanthropic way. Yet another reaction was that some companies thought, well, we do actually have core competencies. How can we use them to help, for example, governments to address the crisis? How can we make sure that we use our competencies to fill gaps and meet deficiencies in what the healthcare system now needs? So you probably saw in the government context, some factories adjusted their operations and they are now producing masks. So they no longer produce fast fashion, they produce masks. Another way of reacting, I mentioned just before, is that a lot of companies are now becoming the explicit good employer. providing very flexible working hours, providing sick leave for their employees, etc. I think this is the most common reaction for a lot of American companies. And then a third way of reacting to this crisis is for companies that what I would call have a business model that is based on very close relations with other business partners. Those companies make an early commitment to, no matter what, they will honor their contracts, and whatever they ordered, for example, will get paid. And they're trying to be very creative in figuring out the support, how to support the supplier's business continuity. And you know, these 5 typical reactions, as I clustered them, of course, they're not mutually exclusive. There are a lot of companies that do multiple things. For example, Adidas, a German sportswear company, they have provided funds, you know, for a relief fund. They have also adjusted operations. They're producing masks. In Germany, they're considered a very good employer. And in addition, they made a strong commitment that they will, of course, pay for all existing orders, accept the shipments, and pay those orders in full, which is probably the minimum requirement that you can expect from those companies. Companies, despite of their instinct to react to the crisis in a way that goes beyond sort of their very narrowly focused business interest, have come under a lot of critique in the more recent weeks. And the Courrier International actually had a short article where they cited me referring to a fear that the Corona crisis may lead to companies so-called Corona washing. So they engage in activities that look fantastic, but in the end, these activities are not more than just cosmetic adoptions of changed business practices or PR exercises. I've seen a lot of reports where companies, for example, donated masks, and the number of masks they donated sounded really big, but in the end, you know, it's unclear how significant that truly is for a large corporation, and whether they could not do something more substantial. I think the default response of most companies was to react in, to provide charity, to support others financially, versus looking inward and figuring out what could we do with our core competences, and how could we make sure that through our core business processes, we protect, for example, vulnerable workers in our supply chain. This was the less common reaction, and so now there is a discussion ongoing which companies are actually engaging in a true commitment in a sense of a business and human rights commitment, and which companies are doing merely PR or what could be called Corona washing. In all this, I don't want to downplay the tremendous economic pressure that companies are under right now. A McKinsey report that was published last week highlighted the pressure that fashion companies are under. It's estimated that the revenues for global fashion brands will be reduced by around 30% this year. And by the end of the year, McKinsey estimates that around 80% of publicly listed fashion companies in Europe and the US will be in financial distress. You may have seen that yesterday, one big American fashion brand actually announced that they're bankrupt. J.Crew, you probably followed those news. So it's already happening, and there will be more coming by the end of the year. So of course, understanding that even those brands are under tremendous economic pressure, yet the responses are quite different. And it's an interesting research question to figure out how comes that if companies are all under tremendous economic pressure, the responses to the crisis vary so tremendously. This next slide is a table that comes from a very critical advocacy organization, the Worker Rights Consortium. They are tracking the COVID-19 responses of fashion brands, and they put them in 2 camps, namely the ones that actually commit to pay orders in full and accept the shipments and pay on time. And then other brands that, you know, in panic mode, dropped every commitment they ever made to their suppliers and even refused to pay for existing orders. And, you know, this is a list that was tweeted. This is a list that's publicly available. And of course, you know, being on the wrong side of history here may have effects on your reputation. I'm not saying this list is perfect, but it's something that is publicly communicated, and companies on either side now have to figure out, well, do we actually, you know, want to be publicly ashamed to be not one of those companies that are, through core business practices, living up to the commitment that they all made. All those fashion brands on paper commit to respect human rights, but when a crisis hit, I think it really shows if this is for real. So here you can see sort of how the current industry falls into two camps, where brands, well, say, of course, we have to make sure that the factories that produce our goods and the workers that work in those factories have some form of protection, because the governments in the countries where our production takes place are often unable to provide such a protection, and others that unfortunately have just dropped the pen. So in my research, I've mostly focused on the different business models that companies engage in, for example, to manage their global supply chains. And this is a table from a research paper that we're currently working on. We have looked into different fashion brands and identified two different business models, one that I call the transactional model and the other one that I call the relationship-based business model. And you can see the differences in this table. The company that I looked at in detail was Decathlon. Decathlon is a French sports retailer with their own brands. And Decathlon had from the very beginning said that we only want to create true partnerships with our suppliers. We want to work with them longer term. We don't play that typical game of whoever offers a cheaper price for an order, we go for it. So they're not switching suppliers frequently. They actually build up long-term relationships with their suppliers. They are frequently communicating with those suppliers. In fact, in most factories where the Decathlon production takes place, they have a Decathlon person present to ensure that quality standards are met and human rights standards are met. So it goes hand in hand for them. They work so closely with their suppliers that they even make a joint 5-year business plan. They don't negotiate prices. They see that this doesn't add any value. They rather want to introduce a system, what they call open costing, where they understand the cost of each side and then try to figure out how to reduce those costs. They also understand that the workforce needs to be developed, so they provide intense training opportunities for the workforce in the factories which they work with. They understand that often the wages in garment factories are too low to make a living. So in their 5-year plan, they built in wage increases. So as productivity improves, they can also justify wage increases. So it's part of a 5-year plan, and understanding that, of course, wages need to go up. You know, the fact that in this Decathlon relationship-based model, workers are more satisfied is expressed in the fact that there's much lower turnover. So some of the factories, for example, in Ethiopia that I visited last year, had over 100% turnover. This means that the entire workforce is replaced over a 12-month period. At the Decathlon factories, turnover rates were much, much lower. Why? Because workers felt in jobs that are decent, not fantastic jobs, but jobs that are decent. And it really helped Decathlon to improve quality over time, improve productivity, and at the same time ensure that basic human rights standards are respected and wages are slowly increasing. And so for me, this relationship-based business model is more conducive to a human rights commitment. A transactional business model where you switch suppliers the moment prices go up is just incompatible with a commitment to respect human rights in your supply chain. And I believe that this difference is also the explanation for a future business success. So let me get to this. There are a number of business intangibles, one being trust. This is from Harvard Business Review from January 2020, so just before COVID hit. And trust is the social glue that holds business relationships together. They even show, there are multiple studies, that if there's trust between business partners, you lose less time and money to negotiate over things. It's a different way of communication. And that's exactly what I see in the government context. The business model that has built a business upon relationships works better in times of crisis where a lot of adjustments need to be made on short notice. They can talk to each other. They don't have to just cut off things. And I actually inquired with Decathlon how they are handling the crisis with their suppliers. And they sent me an email that they sent out to all suppliers. And, you know, Decathlon is a French company. So the email was in English. The English wasn't polished at all. But it was just the right tone to assure their strategic partners in the supply chain that they will do anything they can to ensure business continuity. They committed to, of course, paying for all orders. They said they will try to restart production in calendar week 18. They said they can reach out in case they need a short-term loan. So all this support goes far beyond what most, I would say, fast fashion companies have been doing. So I think it shows how closer your relationships are and how greater the trust level, the better you are able to manage this crisis, to ensure that you're ready to pick up production again once the crisis eases off, and it ensures business continuity long term. Because Decathlon made these long-term plans, I think they're also better prepared to stick to them even through such a crisis. An organization that closely tracks trust levels is the Edelman Trust Barometer, and they've done a special report in times of COVID-19. I followed this closely, and at the beginning it was very interesting. They said that trust levels are at a record low, but interestingly, employees trust their employer more than they trust their own government in 8 out of 10 countries. So this, of course, shows the outsized influence that the private sector can have on managing such a crisis, because there's greater trust of more people into whatever companies put out there than their own governments. So in the past weeks, there have been a few changes. So just this morning, there was an update from the Edelman Trust Barometer. And they actually found that, well, trust in government has actually increased. It's never been as high as in May 2020 for the past years. And unfortunately, despite of the talk of many companies, how much they're engaged in supporting the COVID-19 crisis, there's a growing skepticism that CEOs and companies are actually doing the right thing. So there was, people start questioning whether the private sector could not do more or could do things differently. The CEO of Edelman, Mr. Edelman, says that business will be looked at very closely in the months ahead. So how companies perform in areas such as retaining and reskilling workers or using small businesses in the recovery for their supply chain will become a critical issue. So even if right now everyone is way too busy to look closely into how companies responded to the crisis, this may catch up with them eventually. This may come back to them. I mean, I showed you that, you know, critical NGOs like the Workers' Rights Consortium are already putting fashion brands in two camps, the ones that are doing the right thing and the ones that are not doing the right thing. And I think these type of exposés will grow. It will become clear who was standing on the right side of history during this crisis, and it will affect how they recover. And given how transparent our world has become, I think there's no place to hide for companies that are now not doing the right thing and that are not, for example, ensuring that human rights are being respected. I think business and human rights will become a topic that whose importance will even grow during and after this crisis. And I think the scrutiny that companies are under will also grow. So things will become more transparent. It will become clear who handled the crisis the right way. And just imagine you're a manufacturer in, let's say, Bangladesh, and you know, one of the companies that really cut off all business relationships immediately was Next. It's a UK fashion brand. You're now coming back next month asking the very same supplier to again do production for you. Guess how well that will be going. Individual suppliers in Bangladesh are very keen to restart production, and they probably can't afford to say no to suppliers. But of course, you can also imagine that if someone else comes and asks them, they probably prefer someone else who treated them better during this time. I've had an interesting conversation with one of those factory managers over the weekend, and he told me that he's still waiting for $10 million to be paid to him from major fashion brands that just now refuse to make payments. And of course, it translates to his workforce. He has 2,000 workers and is usually employed in his factory. And he's unable to pay them right now, which means that they're starving. And these are sort of the trickle down effects from the top of the supply chain to vulnerable workers in the supply chain. And making a commitment to business and human rights is understanding the business implications on human rights of all business decisions. It's a question of how do companies make money and not how they spend it. I can tell you many of those fashion brands have very elaborate so-called CSR departments, corporate social responsibility. These CSR departments have either closed or have been reduced dramatically over the past weeks because they're not relevant. They're not business relevant. CSR departments exist because the company does business as usual, and the CSR department then adds to business as usual in a way that just makes things look a bit better. But it doesn't require the company to fundamentally question their business model. And the business model that I've introduced you to, that, for example, Decathlon, but also others, H&M and Nike are now transitioning to, namely this relationship-based model, I think is a lot more robust in terms of ensuring that your business partners and your customers continue to trust you. And it's a lot more robust to get you through a crisis and to recover after a crisis. And so with this, I want to close. I look forward to your reactions. I put out pretty bold hypotheses. So I'm keen to hear from you what you think. And of course, I invite you to look at the websites of the Geneva Center, the NYU Center, and stay in touch with me. This is my email, and you can also follow me on Twitter, or we're also on LinkedIn and all kinds of other social media channels. Please, with this, I'll hand back to Ali to manage the Q&A.
Okay, thank you, Doris. So can you sort of unshare your
yes.
So sort of, so you can actually,
yes.
So people can actually pin Now, this is really interesting. I mean, for me, this is really refreshing because it's very different than typical business and human rights presentation, where they talk about, protect, respect, remedy, or commitment to respect, due diligence, remedy, that kind of a thing, where you're really talking about getting people more into the mindset of avoiding legal challenges. Now, when you talk about trust, it's a different story. It's a completely different story.
Yeah.
I've seen lots of people, even in project management, where they talk about project management in a very dynamic environment. In a very dynamic environment, it's very hard to put a legal document of the details that you're trying to achieve, because it's extremely dynamic and it might not have a pretext before. And the only replacement is trust.
Yes.
Which is a very interesting point in my view, that you bring it up, and it really builds up more of you're building a social capital by being good to your suppliers and to your workforce, and that should carry you more in even in harder times than in better times. So I really thank you for this. Now we're going to take questions, and the questions are going to be compiled actually by Kariman, and she's going to be asking you directly, just to sort of avoid the second person kind of thing. Okay. Kariman, do you have any questions?
Okay.
Can you unmute yourself?
Yeah, there is a question. Do you think that multinationals are responsible for business, for human rights violations that happens throughout the supply chain, their supply chain? Another question, what do you think the proper role of government that governments can play given the desperate need for investment that will face? How can they balance about attracting investment and at the same time protecting human rights? Yeah, so I'll give you the chance to answer this question, and then I will.
So the first question is very foundational. Like, do multinational companies have a responsibility for human rights violations that occur in their supply chain? So I think now there's a growing consensus that, of course, companies at the top of supply chains have responsibility for the business relationships throughout their supply chain, and not just with their first-tier suppliers, the ones that they have a direct contractual relationship with even, but it goes further. Like H&M a few years ago was asked to take responsibility for forced child labor in the cotton production in Uzbekistan. This is a raw material that they use in their production. And more recently, you probably saw the claims of forced labor of the Uyghur community in Xinjiang, China. It's a bit a similar case where 80% of Chinese cotton comes from Xinjiang, and many of those cotton fields are, and cotton production is supported by an Uyghur community that probably lives in concentration camps. Now there's the question, how can companies that use Chinese cotton deal with this human rights violation that is very far removed from their contractual relationships that they have with, let's say, garment factories in China, Turkey, Vietnam, or Bangladesh. So yes, there's a growing expectation that companies look very deep into their supply chain and use their own leverage to address these challenges. Of course, they have the greatest leverage in their immediate direct supply chain. I just want to come back to something that Ali said. You know, trust goes beyond what's being agreed upon in legal terms through contracts. Fashion brands have contracts with their direct suppliers, and it's actually legal for them to cancel orders, because in the fine print of those contracts, it says that if force majeure comes into play, they actually can legally cancel those contracts. But do they really have to evoke this fine print immediately that they see that they might be losing revenues this year? I don't think they absolutely have to do it. And a lot of companies didn't, although they could. Why? Because they understand the difference between what is legal and what is being perceived as legitimate. Of course, it's legal. No one will sue those companies that are no longer paying their suppliers, but it's not perceived as legitimate in that the expectations from all sides would be that you're trying to help each other out. And this is foundational for the level of trust. And building trust takes many, many years and a lot of effort. Breaking it can happen within a few seconds. And a panic reaction, of brands that just cut all ties, I think ruined trust for a very long time. And it will be difficult for them to recover. The second question was, what is the proper role of government? The proper role of government would be to provide clear standards for working conditions, clear, and not just the standards, because in a lot of places, the labor laws are well drafted, but the implementation is not well monitored. So it's also the role of the government in an ideal world to have the standards clear, to enforce the implementation, and then also provide a social safety net in case things go wrong. But of course, we know if we look around the world, this is not what we can assume. We have a declining number of democracies. We have a declining number of social capitalist states. And we cannot assume that the government protects human rights as we wish. And so there's a growing importance of the private sector to step in and fill those so-called governance gaps. I understand that there's a tension between investing, attracting foreign direct investments by government, and asking for additional requirements like human rights, but I don't think this tension is irreconcilable. In the context of the Geneva Center, I'm actually looking for business models where profits and principles can coexist, meaning how can a company grow and make profits, but at the same time, fully integrate respect for human rights through their business model. I also think this is possible for governments. I think there's a way to promote growth and at the same time, make it conditional that human rights are respected. And I want to give you an example again from the garment context. I've worked for many years on Bangladesh, and even after Bangladesh has a 30 billion garment industry, which they grew over the past 30 years, fairly short amount of time, major industry. Now 80% of exports from Bangladesh are garments. Yet the health and safety standards in the garment industry and many other labor rights are still not in a good state. So the Bangladesh garment industry has become the emblematic case for sweatshop conditions in the production of fast fashion. I've then continued my research in Ethiopia, where a garment industry is currently being developed on a green field. So they had no garment industry, but they decided that they want to create jobs through a garment industry. And we went to Ethiopia to help the Ethiopian government to not repeat some of the mistakes that we've seen in the Bangladesh context. So how can they attract foreign direct investment, but make respect for human rights conditional, and figure out how could companies actually create decent jobs for a very large young workforce, and how could this industry then contribute to socio-economic development of Ethiopia. So we made a number of recommendations, including only allowing companies to come in that commit to sourcing from Ethiopia longer term. Because if you're in and out, you're not serious about your commitment to support human rights. But if you say, like Decathlon, we come to Ethiopia, we want to source from Ethiopia longer term, we make 5-year business plans, ideally 20-year business plans, is there, then I think your commitment to establish basic human rights standards in your production sites actually get a chance, and those jobs can become decent jobs, and those decent jobs can contribute to socioeconomic development, I think then this upward spiral that we all hope for through industrialization can take off. Otherwise, you're just sucking out, capital out of a country that then has nothing left once you leave.
Thank you. Another round of questions. Mm-hmm. What are the incentives for the adoption of one of the two business models you have presented?
Yeah.
Do you think that this pandemic will encourage large buyers to invest in automation and localization of the supply chains? And what's the economic consequences of this? Mm-hmm. Unfortunately, most of the companies that do human rights violation have been expressing interest and claiming applying the SDGs, which in first caring about workers and human rights. Does that mean we should revisit applying the SDGs in a better, realistic way and make companies more engaged? Thank you.
These are almost like three questions. So I start with the first one. What are the incentives for either of those business models? I'm trying to make the case that the transactional business model is a business model of the past. It comes with too many risks. If you have no transparency in your supply chain and you're sort of picking and choosing suppliers based on mostly price only, and you're only have short-term engagements with them, you can never control the conditions in those facilities. And with greater transparency, there is an expectation that large brands with a brand reputation do not engage with factories that are sweatshops. Instead, they should help those sweatshops to become decent job providers. So I think there are growing incentives to transition to greater supply chain transparency through a relationship-based business model. And there are many advantages. As I said, if there are unforeseen changes on either side, these can be discussed. The brand can not only provide training on workers' rights, they can provide training that improves productivity. So if productivity goes up, prices remain competitive, and it just becomes a better managed factory that is easier to work with from a brand perspective. You have greater delivery reliability, et cetera, et cetera. So I think there are hard business incentives to transition to this relationship-based business model. The second question was about how will the supply chain change in the future? Will there be more localization, more automation? Absolutely, I think there will be major reflections on how our supply chains need to change. It depends on the industry. On garments, I think moving away from Bangladesh is very difficult because no other place can produce such high volumes at such low prices. So if you're a very large fashion brand, it'll be difficult to move away from Bangladesh. For smaller brands, however, I think they will bring production even closer home. If they are not in need of such huge volumes and their market is in a segment of slightly higher prices, I think they will move even quicker to places closer to home. But also understanding fast fashion becomes ever faster. We as consumers want trends from runways in the shops within 2 weeks now. That's the time that it takes Inditex, that's the holding company of Zara and Massimo Dutti, to bring a trend into their shop, 2 weeks. And so that also requires geographical closeness. So I think there are two forces now. The crisis has shown that the internationalization of supply chains, needs to be reflected upon from a crisis perspective, but also consumer preferences drive shifts in global supply chains with fast fashion brands moving production closer to markets. That's why Turkey has grown tremendously and Portugal has grown tremendously, because it's close to the European market. Inditex basically owns or works with almost every garment facility in Morocco. Why? Because it's so close to Spain. So geographical closeness will matter in the garment context for two reasons: crisis management and consumer preferences. I've talked to Nestlé here, a Swiss company in the agriculture business. They're also trying to figure out how will this crisis change food supply chains. It's different dynamics, but of course, I think this crisis will lead to quite fundamental reflections on, is it truly necessary that if we produce a product that requires coconut oil in Brazil, do we really need to ship the slightly cheaper coconut oil from Indonesia to Brazil, although Brazil also has coconut oil? So these are, I think, things that will be looked at in a new light and not only from a price perspective. The last question about SDGs, through which I hear some frustration that companies are referring to the SDGs as sort of a fig leaf for their engagement with human rights. I'm being told over and over again that, of course, human rights are the foundation of the SDGs, but they're not so explicitly mentioned, and clearly the SDGs are highly aspirational, that do not come with any performance requirements, no hard performance requirements. And I mean, I've now here referred to the term corona washing. You may be familiar with the term rainbow washing in the context of the SDGs, because they come in these beautiful, colorful boxes. And I think there are a lot of companies that are referring to the SDGs from which they can pick and choose a color, choose an objective you would like to work for. And they essentially engage in a version of what could be called rainbow washing, because they are not fundamentally reflecting on the impacts of their business, but they just pick out a small portion where they probably already have a beautiful project that they can then showcase in some beautiful PR material. So for me, this is not a way of engaging with human rights, because a commitment to human rights would require a fundamental reflection on your business model, rather than picking and choosing some individual small objectives that you would like to work for. It doesn't go to the core of how you make your money. For me, it's essentially another opportunity to show how companies are spending money right now. So this is CSR for me.
Thank you so much. Final round of questions. What's the right and wrong practices when it comes to dealing with employees and suppliers in the context of small businesses? Those companies are actually trying to survive, and we accuse, sometimes when we see like them laying off labor, things like that, we accuse them of being harsh to their employees. So if you can talk a bit about that. Also, how companies test their crisis department to make sure if it went through something like the COVID, it can go through something like the COVID-19 from a human rights perspective. Final one, how can we spot the human rights violation within the current constraints? The social distancing, curfews, no flights, limited press activities, no fieldwork, research, things like that. So from where can we get the real picture of how coronavirus impacted the human rights of workers in different supply chains? Thank you.
First of all, thanks for all those questions. These were all really excellent questions. It's really a joy for me to address them. So let's get to small, medium-sized enterprises first. Often there's the assumption that only multinational corporations can implement their commitment to human rights. I actually think this is not true. I've years ago done a study comparing the actual implementation of what it means to engage with human rights between multinational corporations and small, medium-sized enterprises. And I found that often those small, medium enterprises, often family-owned businesses, already have values ingrained, and they already have a business model ingrained where they have super close relationships to all their business partners. This is what Ali referred to, the social capital, which made them flourish in the first place. And so in a way, also they're smaller. So it's not this big ship that you need to slowly navigate. They're more agile, and I think they're already built on the right value foundations that enable the full integration of human rights. I think they're not using human rights language, they're not doing nice CSR reports about it, but oftentimes they're already implementing it. Crisis departments in COVID-19 was a question. Excellent question. I wonder where are the human rights experts in those crisis management teams? I've been asking for that for a few weeks now. Why are they only depending on the company, sort of the logistic, the head of supply chain, or the head of sourcing, the head of finance, and where's the person from inside the company that would highlight the human rights implications of all decisions that are currently being made? Of course, I think they should have a seat at the table. I'll continue asking for that on my Twitter feed. So I hope this is eventually happening, because as I believe this is relevant for recovery, I think it's business relevant for those companies right now. The last question is also excellent. Like, how can we identify those human rights violations at times when we can't do field work, we have to respect social distance, etc. So first of all, this webinar is a way to exchange ideas, which I absolutely love. It's a proxy, it's as good as it gets for now. The field work currently is not possible, but I also mentioned earlier that I was on the phone with contacts that I made in previous field research trips on the phones. I talked to factory managers in Bangladesh to find out what's really going on the ground. And again, I see that there's a major disconnect between, for example, what's happening here in Geneva at the International Labour Organization, where they're signing beautiful documents, and then I talk to factory managers in Bangladesh that tell me it's totally unrealistic. It cannot be implemented in our context. And this is very refreshing. So I'm trying to revive and make sure that I don't lose those contacts. And I always do research where I at some point go to those places. And I rely on those sources now. And to a certain degree, also social media can help. Not a huge fan, but I must say it's become a bit easier to stay in touch with faraway contacts, for example, through Twitter, to find out their local perspective. So we're trying, but it's a bit more challenging. But this will not last forever. And then once we can shed light on how things went during the crisis, I think scrutiny will be greater than ever for some companies. So. All right.
Thank you so much. The floor for Dr. Ali to wrap up. Thank you, Doro. Thank you so much.
Doro, I really thank you. I just have one comment. Mm-hmm. When you talk about violations, I mean, with the exception of the current situation because of the force majeure clause, companies used to hide violations deeper in their supply chains. Now, the interesting thing, when you look at the UN Global Compact, there are two terms for the human rights. The second part talks about complicity. Now, complicity is very hard to sort of catch, because I'm not going to go to your factory and find that you have child labor. It's somewhere deep in, and you can always say, I don't know. So, and there are examples, like in the Rana case, for example, disaster. There were lots of retailers in Europe that were not implicated in legal terms because of it was very hard to prove that they knew anything about it. Yes. The complicity factor was just not there. That puts you more on to get away from government and from business and closer to communities, closer to people, closer to civic society. You're talking about blue whistlers, you're talking about media exposing certain practices And guess what? I'm not going to go buy from this guy because he does this and this and this, irrespective of the legal aspect to it. So the missing part always is the people. How do they aggregate? How do they stand against the violation, which is probably not very well done right now. But maybe we'll see better things in the future of this.
Yeah, you know that most of my research in the Bangladesh context has actually focused on these hidden parts of the supply chain, namely the subcontractors that are used on a routine basis in the Bangladesh garment industry context to help out larger factories to complete orders on time or to meet the increasingly low price requirements. And so subcontracting is really the norm and not the exception in the Bangladesh context. And we've made the case that irrespective of your contractual relationship, if production happens in a facility and your label is being found in the rubbles of Rana Plaza, you're implicated. I mean, Benetton, an Italian fashion brand, had production in Rana Plaza. It took them 5 days to figure out how did it end up in Rana Plaza. They didn't even know that a portion of production was probably illegally subcontracted there. But the incentives for subcontracting come with the business model. If you have very little communication with your supplier and you just set a deadline and a very low price, well, then the supplier tries to figure out how to meet the deadline and how to meet the price requirements, and they just cut corners in any way possible. It's their way of doing smart business, and it's a survival strategy, and it's actually, from a business perspective, very efficient. So it's just risky from a human rights perspective. So if a brand is serious about controlling human rights condition in their supply chain, I think they are unable to continue with the transactional business model, because the transactional business model continuously sets incentives for subcontracting and for creating hidden supply chains where they're not in control of monitoring human rights conditions. So indeed, but I do believe transparency is a fact of life now, and hiding in faraway places you can't bet on that business strategy. That's a ticking time bomb, and that's not, I think, a good long-term strategy. So I wouldn't, for business success, I wouldn't go for that.
Doro, I really thank you for your time. It's been a pleasure. Thanks a lot.
Likewise. I really enjoyed this. Fantastic questions. Yeah, please continue engaging.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks for your initiative setting this up.
Thank you. It's a pleasure, and thank you for joining us. Tomorrow, we're going to have Jenny Hodgson. She's from the Global Fund for Community Foundations, and she's going to talk about community foundations. Next week, we have two fantastic speakers also. We're going to have Anil Gupta. On Tuesday, he's going to talk about leveraging the entrepreneurial potential of economically poor but knowledge-rich grassroots innovators. Stu Hart is going to talk about the new age of sustainable capitalism. So please join us. The recording will be available on our Facebook page probably within 24 hours. Again, thank you, Doro. It's a pleasure.
Thanks so much.
Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.
Take care. Bye.
Thank you all. Bye-bye.